Think of the people you interact with every day. Would you want to spend a day in a canoe with them? Hi, I'm Nathan Mercero, CEO of Planning Alternatives. We're a disruptive brand in the financial planning space with a point of view that true wealth has nothing to do with money. Growing up in a small town in Canada, I experienced examples of families with money and without. It started me on this journey of understanding wealth and the idea that spending a day in a canoe with someone could be one of the best investments you could make. Join me as I sit down with leaders, entrepreneurs, creatives, rule breakers, and friends to discover their perspective of true wealth. And maybe you'll start to shift yours. I'm excited today to be joined by Barrett Wright, who's the president of Hill Robinson USA, a leading global yacht management company based in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Barrett oversees fleet management, operations, client service, crew service, and business development while actively participating in many industry associations. Barrett, welcome to Day in a Canoe. This is a little different on the amenity side from the yacht world that you're accustomed to. But I'm curious how someone from Cleveland traversed the world to land in the yacht business. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your journey.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Nathan. I'm very excited to be here. From Cleveland to super yachts. I think it all actually started when I was fired from my first job out of college. I was working for Sotheby's in Philadelphia. And my boss had detected that I was a little bit bored. This was around the D.D. Brooks and the Alfred Taubman collusion trial between Christie's and Sotheby's. And so, I wanted to go to New York. There was no room there when they were reallocating people. So in June of 2003, I was terminated. And funny enough, I managed to get a job as a cook on board one of my mom's best friend's daughter's boyfriend's best friend's boat, if that makes any
Reaction.
sense. So that's long and short of it. So it was a classic schooner, and it was based out of Newport, Rhode Island. And we cruised through New England into Maine for the summertime. And then we went down to the Caribbean in the winter. And I was on board for about a year. I've never worked so hard in my life. I had no problem sleeping on, salty sailbags in the forepeak when the race crew was on board. So, really, really hard work. But I enjoyed every bit of it. Meeting different people. There is such a community, amongst the yachting group, the private yachts and the commercial yachts too. So it's felt, something that, you ingratiate yourself to it, and then you move around to places, and it's always sort of the same people that you see, whether it's going to be in the Caribbean, whether it's in New England, whether it's in Europe, even down in the South Pacific. So, I loved it. And I came back for a break, and then I broke my ankle, so I didn't immediately go back to it. I did a little fly out into San Francisco and worked on a movie for a little bit. And then I really, really missed the yachting industry. And a friend of mine offered me a job as a mate, Hinckley 70-foot sailboat. So I went back to Newport for summertime and did that. And then I met a boy who was based there, and he worked in the shipyard and was a firefighter. And the next thing I knew, I found a job looking for a yacht designer named Ted Fontaine in Newport, Rhode Island. And he was building, he had his own big, racer cruiser boats that he designed under the Fontaine Design Group. And then he had established a new small day sailor concept, a little 40-foot boat that was built in New Zealand. And that was called the Friendship Yacht Company. And so it was where I stayed for about 5 years. And that's kind of really how I got in the yachting industry. And then a change of job for my husband brought us to Florida. And 5 months later, I found myself as a yacht accountant with Hill Robinson. And, the rest is history. It's almost 15 years ago, which I can't believe. But it's once the industry pulls you, and it's really hard to pull yourself back out of it. You just want to keep on going, and the fraternity essence of it is just amazing. And then again, how dynamic the industry is something that just keeps you, wanting more. No day is the same.
And what is that magnetic field force that pulls you in and you see other people? What's the core draw?
I think for me, it really is the community. But also I just think, it's the personalities. Our clients are so very different from one to the other, to the next, and they all demand different things. And so you really have to learn to adapt, and manage, how you're going to communicate, figure out how you can get, news good news and bad news, communicated with somebody without getting them, exceedingly frustrated or, very disappointing. I pride myself in, immediate responses as best I can. I don't believe that there's no point or postponing response to anybody. If you don't have the answer, best to say, I'm not sure about that right now. Give me, a few minutes and I'll come back to you, with what I know, or certainly introduce you to somebody who's going to know better than me. But, it is a very personal thing. Yachting's very emotional. You were trying to plan a big seminar for Monaco show, and it's sort of a risk management or risk mitigation seminar. And we really kind of broke it down between owning a yacht is one thing, operating a yacht is another. And so I think that's the part that people sometimes fail to understand is the operational part of it.
Now, we're both helping people in the service industry, meaning we're in the service industry, and we're dealing with wealthy individuals. What are, you mentioned one operating principle that you have around speed of response. What have you learned in the service industry that really is important in delivering what you promise?
I think it is that responsiveness, and I think you have to listen. I have one client who's very interesting with the questions that he asks, because it seems like it's what he wants on the black and white of it, but there are layers that are involved in it. And so, it frustrates him if you're not getting into, the nuances of really what the decision is. He wants recommendations, but he doesn't want to tell you what to do or tell him what to do. He doesn't want us to, manage his emotions, but yet there's that part that we're always concerned with, on the other side based on his experience on board. So, it's getting to know your clients, and really it is listening. I think I've managed to separate myself and my team, with the fact that we're very hands-on. It's equally as important to give, as much attention as you can to the captain and to the rest of the crew, as it is to the owner, because in the end, we're all a team and we're working for the big guy or the big gal. And if they don't have a good time, then the last thing that we're going to have to experience is, they say, the hell with this, I'm going to sell the boats, we're going to go off. And, as my husband experienced firsthand, they went and they bought horses on a big farm and the yachts were left behind. So, the last thing that we want is all of us to be out of a job. The whole idea is to keep the owners going. They are what makes the yachting industry so dynamic. They're making incredible developments, with the builds of the yachts, the design of the yachts, and it feeds us all. And so, it's really imperative that they continue to enjoy themselves, and not get frustrated and just walk away.
I'm sure that you've seen some interesting examples of client demands or needs that have arisen. What are some of the more creative and memorable experiences that you've had to jump in and problem solve around?
There's just been, a whole variety of them. I can't tell you the number of times that we've had to get urgent pieces from A to B within this insane time period. So, I joke that my company accountant has, I think, been to most of our offices, throughout the world. We've got 13 offices located, in the Middle East and, in Europe and throughout the UK, down into the US. And so, I often put him on a plane and he flies from one place to pick up, a helmet or like an induction top for a stove, and has to fly to the Caribbean or fly to Cyprus or fly somewhere so that they can deliver it on time in order for it to be met with the, in order to make a client's meeting. We put, cases and cases of a specific type of water, in luggage and flown two people, to Europe in order to be able to deliver it. There was a purse for a birthday that was like vitally important, and there was a delay with, the company delivering it. And so we had to do literally like the Pony Express. And it was, a little bit of like trains, planes, and automobiles to get it finally where it needed to go. But the good news is, it made it there, and the person who delivered it managed to have just enough time for a Cuba Libre before she turned back around and got on the plane and, headed back again. So, yeah, you really don't say no. I think problem solving is a huge part of it. And I think that's the biggest rush that we get, is making, the seemingly impossible possible. I hate saying no to clients, and I don't think clients like to hear no. So, make every effort you can in order to make it happen. And that's what managers are here for.
Now, we're in the Day in a Canoe podcast, and a canoe is a very simple device to transport people across water to a location. As I mentioned, fewer amenities than a yacht. But the most important question that I've learned in my career as it relates to working with people and identifying relational compatibility is simply asking, would I spend a day in a canoe with you?
Mhm.
And just kind of cuts through the noise to focus on who is on the team and how they operate and how it is complementary. And you mentioned that you operate on a team basis. What are you looking for in people when you are looking to add members to your team?
I really like people who have initiative and intuition. I think those are kind of vital for this. You can kind of see storm clouds brewing, or something great happens, and we can just add to it and say, "Oh, this is a really fandangled thing. This is so cool. Let's just pass this along. They're just gonna absolutely love it." And that's a star on your cap. And then it's unfortunate that a lot of the time we're dealing with things that are fixing problems, things that come up. And so I really think that if somebody, is able to see a problem starting or see something that can be the icing on the cake, that's huge. But then being able to figure out how to head it off, I think is something that's enormous. And so, I think with that comes a little bit of, confidence. You have to have confidence in your decision making. You have to be able to make a judgment call. I sometimes I get frustrated with my team because people are hesitant on making a decision. And I think, just as part of the company, it's one of those that there's a line manager, a director, partner and things. And sometimes you get a little bit lost in the minutiae of who's going to approve what. But at the point, one of the partners, Nikhil, always says, just do it. Just get the client what they want. Just do what you think is best based on the facts that we have. Make that decision. And, again, you just go back and you ask for forgiveness. Don't wait around for asking for permission. So, if an employee or me or anybody has, this is what I recommend based on these situations, or this worked out in the past, I think we can try it here. I think those things are huge. And again, I really want that within my team. I think the bigger picture is there. I love that most of my team is completely comfortable on the telephone. They don't rely on email to communicate with the captains, the owners, representatives. I think in tone, we've learned the hard way too that, sometimes the written word can, sort of, trigger somebody. There's some people who don't like to say, dear so-and-so or hello so-and-so. They just put your name down and it's like, whoa, I'm in trouble. So I think, picking up the phone is a really great way in order to avoid any of those miscommunications and misunderstandings. But it's also a great way in which to develop those relationships. And within the yachting industry, relationships are absolutely everything. Majority of my new business comes from referrals, and the referrals come from a job that's well done. And that requires my entire team. It's not just me. It's, one of them going out of their way, with a budget or handling crew issue or finding a solution. And that stuff really does, make the difference. And so I take pride in the team, and that we're able to do that. And that makes us different than the others.
You mentioned the word intuition, and I find that's a really fascinating area. Me personally, I was always for a number of years. I recognize I have intuition, but I would rely on my head over my intuition, meaning I'd rationalize things or I'd examine things or put things under a microscope and analyze them. How do you cultivate or coach people towards using more intuition? Because I found that the more that I've relaxed that analytical side of myself, my intuition is thriving more. What's your experience in that space?
I totally believe listening to your gut. There's something that's going to come through, just something that is like, if you just feel that I know this is gonna be the way, but something is just pulling me harder in this direction. I would say, listen to your gut. And again, the emotional side of things is huge within this industry. And so, there's the emotion involved, but, I think, kind of like premonition. I was reading a book where that is actually, something that's legitimate. If you do feel it, and sometimes you can walk into a room and it's like, oh, I knew this was going to happen. Or, a friend comes back from a vacation. Oh my God, she's engaged. And I was like, I knew that was going to happen, without not knowing, the other side of the puzzle. So I think that intuition is great. And I think that the intuition is also learned based on experience. And so I think you can draw on a lot of experiences in similar situations. And that's where I say to a lot of clients, that's the value of yacht management. That is where we add the value because we've been there and probably done it, or we've been in a very similar situation and then been able to work it out. We've got an entire network of people, who we can build on those experiences and that guidance from too. And so, some of the things are repetitive, but, some things are elements of, stuff that we've dealt with beforehand. And so I think just based on that, you kind of just sort of see things coming and know where it's going to go and just say, let's head this off right now. And avoid that. And I think that, that experience that you can get and that I rely on from all of my colleagues and even all of my industry colleagues, it's invaluable. And that's where I think a lot of the intuition comes from. You're going to have been there something similar beforehand and just go with it. And if you haven't been, then there's somebody on the telephone, on the other end who's probably been there with you and is able to help guide. But I really think that your gut instinct and your first instinct, generally is, the right way to go to start.
I'm a big believer that the school of life is one of the best teachers that we could ever ask for. But fortunately, many times when class is in session, at least from my point of view, I'm not really a great student to say, oh, here's a great learning opportunity. I'm more maybe frustrated at the moment or saying, how do I navigate this? Looking back at your career, and you've navigated a lot, just having to pivot, having to make decisions, evolve in your career. What are some of the memorable moments that you can say, looking back, I learned something, or I learned X because I see it differently today than when I did in the moment?
So I can be a very stubborn person. I'm a redhead, I one side of the family is Scottish and all of that stuff. And then, there's no reason. So, there's that is inherently there. And so it comes with that stubbornness. I also have a fierce temper, and things. And so, when I first started out sort of as my role as a yacht accountant, in the super yacht industry, it was easy not to deal with people or have to, deal with that emotional side of things. But then when I was promoted sort of as the interim president of Hill Rob USA, after my boss had resigned to go out on his own, I had to adapt to the people element of it. And I am not a people manager. My energy is steel according to the talent dynamics. And so to me, it's procedures, it's black and white, it's the detail, it's, timing, following all that stuff. So I really had to learn how to manage people. And I learned a couple of, hard ways. I finally the company had invested in some coaching for me. And the coach said, okay, you have to go from, visualize this. You're going to go from like a passionate freight train, which is what I describe myself as, into an adaptable sailor. And how are you going to get there? And so I had to do, quite a bit of training on it and how to handle conflict, and things like that. And of course, find that 10-second gap, that's valuable. And so those are the things that I constantly have to pay attention to and constantly remind myself. It's very easy to be able to manage my responses when it comes to clients. But when it comes to managing people on a team are things I really have to pay attention and really be thoughtful about how I explain something in full, or if something has just completely infuriated me, I can't just blow up and just say, "Ugh, just do it." I don't understand why the people didn't, do what I said. I've explained it 1,000 times. And I had one accountant who actually called me out because I was just livid and furious that something hadn't been done the way that I'd explained multiple times over and demonstrated multiple times over. And she was new to the company, so she was inheriting a little bit of a mess, that she was trying to fix. And I lost it, and I wound up taking it out on her. And she came back the next day and basically announced that she was resigning because she can't work in this kind of, environment. And that really, I was enormously embarrassed. I had to, apologize profusely and say, "You're right. You're absolutely right. There was no reason for me to behave that way, and I'm sorry. I hope you'll stay and reconsider, it." And luckily she did. And, that was about 3 years ago. So, we've now gone to it. And she's actually, now one of my more, I think, reliable, employees there. And I think we figured out she knows it. If you do it and give it to her to understand, now that she has the experience, she will go and do it. And I have every faith and confidence in that. But really, that was a marked moment for me where she called me out on my own behavior, and I become all the more in tune to that, and really kind of, my management style is not to be, here behind closed doors above everybody else. Is sitting, in the muck. I will cover for the accountants and still do the accounting return, still pay bills, when they're gone. I will still edit things for everybody, and be there on the ground floor because everybody needs that support. They excel at one section, but, not at everything. So that's what we're all there for. I need all of them, to help me and to help us be successful with our clients. So the people management side has been a huge lesson.
Well, I commend you on the transparency of sharing that story and having the realization that there's something to learn in yourself. And I think that is the gift that some of these challenging situations give us, is that they can act as a mirror where we can see ourselves in a new light. And I think that's the greatest gift that we can give ourselves when we have that self-reflection and being willing to be coachable and learn from these situations.
That's not to say on the other side that the clients are going to be the same way. So sometimes you just have to be like, that's water up, that's back, and tomorrow's another day, and okay, I won't do it again, that kind of stuff. So yeah, sometimes
Yeah, fair
one and a half
enough.
on the
There
street.
there is no life is not an Excel spreadsheet that we can just create a formula and have predictable outcomes all the time. And I think
No.
that's, yeah, I get that being in the finance world, that it's great to put everything in a spreadsheet, but real life doesn't match spreadsheets.
I know.
Barrett, it's been fantastic to spend time together, and I want to thank you for sharing with listeners your experience, your perspective, and wish you all the best in your future, and good luck on the yachting scene.
Thank you, Nathan. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review. To discover what wealth means to you, please take our assessment at planningalt.com.